Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Annedria Beckham, and I'm here today to talk to you guys about what we're doing at Beckham Estate Vineyard and 80 Beckham wines. And so I guess, to set the stage, my wife and I moved out here to Parrot Mountain in 2004 with the intention of building a pottery studio. And when we arrived here in 2004, everything was in timber. So it's been a major transformation of the terrain, the way the property looks. So when we came out here, we got sidetracked in the first few months and got to know our neighbors who were growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and selling wine out of their garage on the weekends. And we spent a lot of time with Fred and Jill the first few months we were here, and I helped Fred prune his vineyard. Came home with a truckload of cuttings. My wife said, what are we doing here? And I said, oh, we'll plant a few rows. Why don't we give it a shot? And that led to us cutting the timber down and prepping and planting the land. And so Andrea and I did all of the work here on our own, at least initially. We rented a 90,000 pound track hoe and a high track cat and pulled all of the stumps. We pulled initially about 1,100 stumps off the first 8.5 acres. And prepped the land, and then we propagated the vines on our living room floor, and we started planting, really kind of going into things somewhat blindly. And we planted about 4.5 acres the first year we were here of Pinot Noir, and then I did the farming. I went, and worked with the local Hispanic guys to see what was sustainable and what was working and what wasn't in vineyards near us. And in 2007 and 8, we sold our first lots of fruit to Lang Estate in Dundee. And when I delivered the fruit in 2007 to Jesse Lang, I drove down to the bottom of the hill and turned around and went back. And I said, Jesse, I have so much invested in this. Is there any way that I can be a part of the winemaking process? And so it was in 2007 that I started to learn how to make wine. And I worked with a couple different winemakers, one former geologist and scientist who was all about data collection, and another gentleman who's a school psychologist who really was more concerned about how the wines made him feel. So I worked with two really different winemakers. We made our first vintage in 2009, just 250 cases. And it's so interesting to reflect back and taste these wines that we made initially. I was making wines by imitating my mentors at that point, and didn't really have an understanding of myself as a winemaker and where our direction really was going to wind up going. So in 2009, we made a 15% heavily oaked Pinot Noir that was just kind of a big boy, a big monster. And we've gone so far in the opposite direction from there now. It's quite curious. So we continued adding more vines along the way. In 2009, we planted some more Pinot Noir. Luke and Trini were involved in planting some new acreage that we acquired in 2013. I think we started planting that in 2014, or maybe it was 15. We planted rootstock on an additional 20-acre parcel. And so now, to kind of bring us full circle, we've now got 36 acres here in total. We have just under, 16 planted. We have another 4 acres of Gamay Noir we're putting in this spring in April. So we've got about 7 acres of Pinot Noir, an acre of Riesling. We'll have 4 acres of Gamay going in this spring. We have what I think is probably one of the largest Trousseau Noir plantings in the Pacific Northwest, certainly, but perhaps in the U.S. We have about 4 acres of Trousseau Noir, which we vinified for the second vintage this year in 2020. Our first vintage was 2019. We've got Savagnin Blanc, so about an acre of Sauv Blanc. We have Aligote, and then we've got some other more obscure Italian varietals that we're we're growing thinking about a warming climate. So we've got Skippertino, we've got Albana, Montuni, and Nebbiolo. So, really, I guess more than anything, we're trying to focus on farming and growing varietals on our estate that will vinify here is kind of our end game, is getting back to just working with fruit. And so I think, the most important thing for us is the farming and how we can farm for style. Am I going too long, Trini? Okay, I'll just keep going until you want to stop me.
No,
So,
it's great. Thank you.
so we're making wine without any manipulation of chemistry, and to achieve that, we're working harder than anything in the vineyard. I think essentially the way I look at it is that we're farming for acid. And so with Pinot Noir, for example, with these warm vintages, we have to work really hard to make sure the fruit doesn't get too ripe. And so we use some tactics that look different than others, perhaps maybe not different than everyone, but we're 100% dry farmed. So we've never irrigated from the beginning, which takes more patience and establishment. You have to, let the vines find a source of moisture. They're going to grow roots vertically down into the ground versus horizontally. And I think if you're irrigating, you're creating a situation where the vines become dependent on water. They're almost like crack addicts, and they have to have the irrigation because the root system has not developed in the same fashion or the same way as that you would get when you're dry farming. So we don't till the soil. That's another interesting thing. It's been almost 7 years since we've tilled or turned any of the soil. We also don't do much in the way of leaf plucking. So just a very mild thinning of leaves to get some dappled light on the east side of the canopy. We only hedge once, and sometimes we don't hedge or crop the top of the canopy off at all. We use animals on our farm, so rather than running the tractor down the rows to mow, we try to integrate the sheep and have them graze, and they're terrific at what they do. They mow and fertilize and punch in organics. They're little tiny Southdown baby doll sheep that walk right under the trellis. And we pick early. So these things together are what we're trying to use, these tools, to achieve good natural acidity in our wines, so we don't have any reason or need to acidulate or manipulate the chemistry. So regarding the winemaking piece, in 2013, I started making amphora to make our wines. And it was that same year that I really started reflecting and thinking about all the different products that winemakers, including myself, were using in their fermentations and in the aging of the wines. And so I really decided, and this also happened when we started farming organically, when we transitioned from conventional to organic farming, I decided to stop using things in the fermentation. So we didn't use any commercial yeasts in 2013. We just used the native yeast from the vineyard. We didn't filter the wines. We didn't add tartaric acid or water or do other things to manipulate the chemistry. We didn't use any enzymes, and we just were using what we had on the fruit. And we, I think, stopped using new oak barrels. And so 2013 was really a major pivot and transition for our project. So we went from conventional to organic farming, and we started making wines with minimal to really zero intervention. So since 2013, we've been making our wines without the use of commercial yeast, without filtration, and I guess the only thing we're adding to the wines, this would be important, is a little bit of sulfur at bottle. So we typically add between 25 and 30 parts of sulfur at bottle, which is quite minimal. Um, yeah. So where should I go from here, Trini? Should I?
I think that maybe could you just for some of us who are less familiar, could you kind of maybe take us through um, the difference between when you were working with barrels and then how an amphora is different, both in terms of any process in the winemaking and in the physical texture of the wine to flavor and taste?
Sure. Okay, super. So we are still making wines in wood, in oak barrel, and we do use some acacia wood. So we've got two labels. I'm sure you guys all know this. We have the Beckham Estate label, and then we have the 80 Beckham wines that are made in terracotta. So it's cool because we are making wines that are sisters. A lot of times, Andrea's just done um, kind of a winter, I don't know what you would say, like a tasting project, sort of. No, that's not right. A tasting experience where you can taste the estate and the Creta side by side. So we've sold a lot of these 2-bottle packages where people can taste 17 estate made in French oak and 17 estate made in amphora next to each other. So there's a lot of differences between making the wine in terracotta and making the wine in wood. Um, so I guess maybe to begin with, the size and scale of the pots and how they relate to the size and scale of other fermenters and barrels for aging. So when I started the amphora project, I was working to make bigger pots, essentially. The first vessels I made were just under the size of a barrel, like 45, 50, 55 gallons. And over time, I've been able to increase their volume in size. Now we're making a commercial version of the Novum that's 950 pounds of wet clay and just under 500 liters. So the initial push was to increase the volume and the capacity, the scale of the containers. And once we got to the point where we had a volume that was workable in the cellar, so stuff that was like 70 to 90 gallons is a really great size for fermentation. We really started to notice a lot of differences in the way the amphora performed versus a conventional fermenter. So what we have noticed over the last 7 or 8 years working with these containers is that during fermentation, we have a much cooler, slower, and longer ferment. So in a 2-ton container in our ambient space, no inoculums, so big container, steel container, we'll see ferments that take like 10 to maybe 15 days and temperatures that are close to 30 degrees Celsius. And in the amphora, with the same fruit harvested under the same conditions, we'll see fermentation temperatures that are around 20 degrees Celsius and ferments that that have a duration of close to 45 or 50 days. So just after the primary fermentation, we have wines that are really different in terms of their expression, just because of the nature of the fermentation. The wines made in the amphora are a little brighter, higher tone. They have a little more tension as they haven't gotten as hot. To me, they always have a little more energy. So there's certainly a difference right there with the fermentation. When we press off and we go back to either the wood barrel or to the amphora, we start to see some really interesting things as well. So the amphora are porous, and if we look at the dissolved oxygen in an amphora versus a wood barrel at a 1-year duration, we notice that there is around 3 to 5% more dissolved oxygen in the wines that are made in clay. And so what this means is that the wines are evolving at a faster rate, and not in a bad way. They're more cohesive, I think, earlier in their life. We get more of an integration of flavor and components, the texture that comes from the clay earlier on in the wine's evolution. And because we have that oxygen in the front end of the wine's life, the wines are very long lived once the cork has been pulled. We notice that the wines made in amphora hold up more so than the wines made in wood over time. So we've also then got some really interesting stuff because of the nature of what the clay is. It is clay, and it has a negative ionic charge. So we see that the amphora are working as fining chambers that are clarifying and bringing the wine to a much more finished sort of position, a finished state. The negative ionic charge binds proteins, and it acts like a product that a lot of winemakers use called bentonite, which is a clay-based slurry, to achieve the same fining goal. So we're we're seeing that the wines that are aged in amphora have more clarity, certainly. We've got this really interesting kinetic quality to the containers that is quite remarkable because of their pointed bottom and elongated shape and shoulder, and the natural temperature stratification that occurs inside of them. We see that this energy, this movement, starts in kind of a vertical sort of cycle where you've got cooler contents at the bottom rising to the top. And because of the shoulder of the vessel, the contents come up like this. And if we're on the skins, the cap rolls over and compresses down and into itself. But more interestingly, if we're fermenting juice, we see that this action turns into a vortex at mid-fermentation. So we don't have to go into the containers and do any batonnage or stirring of the lees. The lees are in a constant state of turbidity because of the kinetic energy locked up in the container. So when we empty them, we have a very different situation with the lees bed and the contact of the lees with the wine. The lees and the amphora go all the way up to the shoulder. So we've got like hundreds of times more surface contact than we do in a barrel where all the lees are essentially settled and kind of compressed into the bottom of the container. So we've got the kinetic piece, the temperature piece, the oxygen piece. They have a surface that is somewhat rough because of the particles of clay and the way the thing fires, the vessels fire. There's a ton of surface area for tartrates to precipitate on. So that's another difference between a barrel and an amphora. We accumulate more tartrates in the amphora, and quite curiously, we can go from red to white to red ferment without any pigment consequence. So they're quite versatile in that you can make or age a red wine in them, Malbec, for example, and then make Riesling in them without any pigment uptake, which is unlike wood as well. So those are all kind of analytical sort of observations, stuff that we've gathered with data, and then I think there's also the sensory piece. So when we're tasting the wines that are made in amphora versus the wines made in wood, they have a different character. And I think the reason that I'm so enamored and so interested in using the amphora is because of the purity that we achieve. So with all of the wines that we make in French oak, there's a sweetness to the palate that is very familiar, I think, for people when they taste Pinot Noir, for example. The sweetness that comes from the oak tannin is kind of what people expect from Pinot Noir made in Oregon. And then the toast is sort of another component, the flavoring of the toast, and but just neutral oak, and everything we're using here now is like 10 years old or older. The neutral wood has a sweetness to it that we don't see with the terracotta, with the amphora. And with the clay, we get a texture or a mouthfeel that I liken to putting your tongue on a wet rock or a brick or a piece of slate. So there's certainly a mineral component, and I think you can't deny that there's an iron sort of quality to the way the wine feels in the mouth. And so there's a dustiness, kind of a interesting bricky texture without flavor. So we don't have any sweetness that's coming from the wood. And then the way the wines show is also quite intriguing. The wines that we make in wood from our site, if we're talking about Pinot Noir specifically, they have a very fresh sort of red fruit character. We have shallow volcanic soils here. And our site tends to produce a lot of like red cherry, red raspberry, um, sort of red natured fruits. Um, with the amphora, we have the same kind of red quality in the fruit, but rather than fresh fruit like fresh strawberries or fresh cherries, it's more of a dried fruit leather sort of essence. A little bit more like floral component and a little more spice to the wines that are made in amphora. So they really do taste dramatically different from each other. Um, we also see typically a little less alcohol in the wines made in clay, and I think that has to do with their evaporative quality during ferment. We wick out some of the sugars and potential alcohol, and they are a little more clarified as well. Okay, wow, I'm rattling on and on and on.
No, this is great. So the other thing that maybe, for example, we just really got some new releases from you that we're going to start tasting with accounts in January. And so I think what we got was the Aqualis, which I think is a new name for the 50/50, as well as the Trousseau and the new Creta, maybe.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember what we got, but I think most important is the estate fruit, and also, so if you could talk a little bit about these wines, which and also just kind of your experience now that you've been working both with purchase fruit and working with your own farm fruits. Maybe if you could take us through that, what the difference is from you as a winemaker perspective in terms of the economics of that, because I think that what we're seeing, I noticed that when we work with European producers, the default in Europe is farming your own fruit, right? So negotiant situations where you purchase fruit to make wine is not as prevalent. But in the States, we've seen a lot of winemakers who don't do any farming at all, and it's pretty common here to just purchase fruit and make wine. And so I wonder if you could just kind of, since you have experience with both, you could kind of take us through that process and how it to compare and contrast it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and then and also hit on the wines that you've just brought into the market. Okay. So why don't I start with the Equalis, and then I'll talk about the Trousseau, and then I'll talk about some of the vineyard economics that we see. So the Equalis, this is this has been a really fun project. We've been taking Pinot Noir out of our vineyard and planting other varietals. And in fact, we're going to remove another like half acre of Pinot Noir that we've been growing for rosé um, this spring, where we're going to put some Gamay. And so I'm interested in trying to do stuff with Pinot Noir that other people aren't doing. And so the amphora has been a great differentiator for us. Um, but we were interested in exploring what else we could do with the varietal that could bring some interest and intrigue to it. So we've been making a skin contact Pinot Gris since 2013, and our typical Pinot Gris spends just under 1 year macerating on the skin. So it's certainly way more of a red wine than a white wine, and it's way more than a rosé, because its maceration is almost a year. And so having made that wine and discovering the interesting stuff that the Pinot Gris skins can provide in terms of tannin, and how the flavors can really evolve and change when we're on the skins for such a long duration, I was interested in co-fermenting Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. And, I think like a lot of people and a lot of times we draw inspiration from others. So I had a wine with Nate Reddy a couple years prior to making the Equalis at a dinner, and it was a co-ferment that he did with Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. And I thought, wow, this is really super different than anything I've had before. So in 2017, we had an abundance of fruit, and I decided that this would be a perfect vintage to try something different. So I couldn't remember for the life of me what the ratio was that Nate had used when he made this wine that was a co-ferment. And I thought, well, crud, we'll just split it down the middle and we'll do 50-50. And so we co-fermented Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris together in equal parts. And what we get is something that is neither, but is both. And it's very, it's a really fun wine for us. It's a wine that can be, I think, served at a cooler temperature. It can even be served chilled. The Gris brings this really kind of cool spicy tannin to the picture, and it's very light on its fruit. It's very lifted and aromatic, and I think the Pinot Gris kind of enhances the red fruit profile that we get from our Pinot Noir. So this wine we call the Equalis now, meaning equal parts, and so it's been a really exciting wine for us to share with people, because I don't think a lot of folks are familiar with those two varietals being fermented and showcased together. And when I had a chance to share this wine with Nate, it was kind of fun to ask him what the ratio was that he'd used in the wine I'd had prior, and it was 20% Pinot Gris and 80% Pinot Noir. So that's the Equalis, and the Pinot Gris. Maybe this is a good segue. The Pinot Gris we don't grow on our site because of, really more than anything, the economics of it, and so that's an interesting wine to fit into this conversation, because half of it's made with purchased fruit and the other half is estate grown fruit. So, I think to start hitting on the economics, your location certainly has a large deal, or has a large degree to the expense of what the fruit's going to cost to grow. And, here we're relatively close to Portland. So the land is expensive where we're at. It's definitely, a lot more expensive to purchase land here than it would be further, deeper into the Willamette Valley, where you're further from Portland. And the tracts of land here where we're at are smaller. So in our AVA, in the Chehalem Mountains AVA, most of the vineyards are around 10 acres. And a lot of them are family owned, and they're smaller growers. So economically, it's hard to sometimes it's hard to make things pencil out well as a grape grower, and especially with the changing dynamics of people's interests in the wines that are being made from Willamette Valley fruit, and the plethora of Pinot Noir that's now been planted. All these things are interesting to factor in. So when we're growing, our expenses as organic grape growers are pretty high. It costs us between $5,000 and $6,000 an acre to farm, and that's kind of the bare bones piece. So if you extrapolate that backwards, I guess, and so if it's $6,000 an acre and you're getting 2 tons an acre, it's $3,000 a ton for the fruit. And on the open market, Pinot Noir 7 or 8 years ago, if you were working with a really high quality grower like Shea, for example, you might spend $4,000 to $5,000 a ton. But there's so much Pinot Noir planted now that on the open market, you can find Pinot Noir last year. The smoke vintage wasn't a good example, but the year prior, you could get Pinot Noir for $1,200 a ton. And, it's hard. You can't grow it for that here. So the people who are growing it and selling it for those sorts of prices are either not very concerned about the profitability, or they're lower in elevation and they're bigger farms, and they're working on a much different scale. So it's been these things are challenging. This is not something I talk a lot about, so maybe if I'm not making sense, it's because I don't know. It's just complicated. So The Pinot Gris that we purchased for the Equalis, we have a per acre contract on that. So we take a risk by buying it in acre increments because we don't ever know exactly how it's going to crop out. And this year was really tough. We have a contract for the Pinot Gris that's $5,000 an acre, which can be, you know, pretty lucrative for us if there's good crop, if there's good tonnage. But in this vintage, in the 2020 vintage, it cropped at less than 2 tons an acre. So, I mean, just doing the math there, it's like about the most expensive Pinot Gris that you can buy in Oregon. And you couple that with the smoke taint that happened this year, and you know that's a tough pill to swallow. So in a year where you've got different conditions, you might get 6 tons for the acre, and you know then your economics look a lot different. So I guess you know the thing that I think about more than anything else with the economics of this is that it's expensive to grow the grapes. And when you're talking about a project like the Trousseau Noir, we've been working on growing Trousseau for, well, 6 years now. So there's a lot of time invested into growing a varietal that's not proven. And I don't know, Trini, I don't know if this is making sense or not.
No, this is, I mean, I think what I just thought was interesting for some of us is that, you know, it sounds like there's a plus and minus of growing your own fruit versus purchasing. And it sounds like if you purchase your fruit, you have flexibility because you can, if there's a trend that like Chenin is more popular or Gamay or whatever, you can switch your production pretty easily. You can pivot every year to, or every couple of years to where the popularity is in terms of styles or grape varieties. And if you're planted, you're kind of committed to it. And even if you want Trousseau, you're investing 6 or 7 years before you even see any fruit coming from it. So it sounds like the investment of planting your own fruit, you have less pivotability. You're kind of more locked into long-term projects, and then you're committed because you own the land and you have the fruit. And it sounds like when you purchase the fruit, you got some flexibility, but it also sounds like with contracts, you can purchase fruit by weight at a certain price, or you can make contracts where they farm the land for you and you just pay per acre that they're farming, which means that maybe the farmer can have better quality yields because they're not trying to sell you by weight. They're
Yeah,
just farming the land, right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, the other piece to it is if you get it right, yeah, you are very committed, obviously, because you put the vines in the ground and it takes years for them to get to the point where they're producing. But if you get it right, you've got, I think, varietals that you can't buy on the open market. So, you know, here right now, it's really hard to find Gamay. You can get it, but it's tough. And I don't know of anyone, well, there's no one that is selling Trousseau. In fact, we get asked many times a year if we could sell any of it at all. So, you know, we've committed, but we've committed to stuff that's cool, that I think has a good future. And you know, the other piece is the control and the consistency and getting to know a vineyard. And you know, if you're a winemaker who buys fruit every year from different growers, you really don't ever understand what the vineyard is. It changes so much. Things can change so much based on vintage, but then there's so much consistency that you also see over time if you're growing the grapes. I mean, it would be it is we've found, you know, varietals that'll come up at the end of the year that are inexpensive, that are interesting, that we can purchase to make wine with. But there's a disconnect there, and I think, you know, as someone who's intimately involved in the winemaking, without the farming piece, it's sort of like you're missing half of the equation in terms of the knowledge and what comes to bear. Um, yeah.
Okay, so this maybe is a time to segue into this most recent harvest, and how affected were you guys by the fires, and how did that affect your strategy towards making wine this year?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay. And I also didn't talk about the Trousseau. So I'll hit that really quick, and then that's a good segue into the fires, because we picked it before we had any consequence from the wildfire. So the Trousseau, I did mention we've vinified it 2 vintages, 2019 and 20. We made a trip to the Jura in 2014 and really fell in love with the people and the place and the wine, and to bring a piece of that back to Oregon. So we planted rootstock, and then we field grafted or chip grafted, tea budded in the Trousseau. That was 5 years ago. And so then we vinified it for the first time in 19. We have 4 acres of it planted. We have 4 different clones. We have a selection Massal of the Bastardo clone, and then we have some FPS material clones 8, 9, and 10. And they're all really different from each other. The way the grape morphology, the cluster sizes, the fruit set, they're all really different. So we've been vinifying them in separate pieces and then blending them together. So my assistant winemaker, Phil, speaks fluent French and is married to a French Tunisian woman. And so I was really leaning on him to try to do some digging to figure out how Trousseau is typically made in the Jura, and like making red wines that I've made before. As we dug into it, we came to the understanding that there are a couple different camps in terms of process, and one of them is to do everything fully carbonically and without any punch down or any breaking apart of the skins and stems. So basically, the fruit would go into the fermenters in a whole cluster situation, and then go through primary fermentation without being punched down or broken apart, and then pressed. And then the alternative to that, as we understood, was to destim and press off really early. So this is really unlike other red wines in that the varietal is so tannic that we are pressing after only like 5 or 6 days into fermentation. So it's, for me, I think maybe Nebbiolo-ish in its tannin, in the bigness of the tannins. So with this varietal, we have the last couple vintages pressed it at about 12 bricks, so it's only a few days into ferment, and then we let it finish fermenting in amphora. And it's quite tannic. It's quite pale, and so it's really sort of deceptive. Its color and the mouthfeel are well, it's deceptively more powerful than it is. So it took some digging to figure out how to make it, and we're really super excited about what we've made. It's light on its feet. It's got kind of the I don't know, the aromatics that you would expect to have in Trousseau. It's got a really cool kind of forest floor and juxtaposed with sour cherries. Yeah, I don't know. So we're very pleased with that wine. So the fires and the smoke. I mean, it was a really hard thing to watch happen here. The event when it first occurred was so up high, we didn't feel like we were in any jeopardy of having any consequence to our vines and our fruit. And then a big windstorm happened, and this was like the kind of the second day of the area being smoky, and it was unbelievable. I think we had winds here like over 80 miles an hour, and it was so dry. The trellis snapped, the big steel post snapped. I think we have over 200 trellis posts that broke off because all of the weight of the canopy was there. And so then it started to become a little more real and a little more scary. And then the smoke blew in and like sat down in here in the on the edge of Parrot Mountain, well, really everywhere. We had a fire a quarter mile from us. We had Chehalem Mountain was on fire, and then we had all the fires near Malala. And so we were here for I think 13 days with like the most gnarly saturated smoke. And it was a tough thing because, you know, no one really knew what to do. And we immediately started hearing of growers like Brooks, for example, and DuPont, and they just decided not to make red wine. And I thought, wow, that seems so reactionary to just write the whole vintage off. And you know, we had so much invested in the farming, just under, well, 16 acres. It cost us about $100,000 to farm for 2020, and I wasn't about to just give up, not try. So we got some of the stuff in early. We got the Trousseau in the second day of the smoke event. It's totally fine. We got a bunch of our rosé picked like 2 and 3 days into the smoke event, and it's fine with no consequence. But we didn't have ripe enough fruit to make proper Pinot Noir at that point, and everyone I talked to seemed to think that it was not going to last very long and it would blow out, and you know, everything would be just fine. And so we hung in there for a couple more days and the smoke didn't leave, and then we were a week into it and I decided it was time to start to make some moves on things. So we started harvesting the Pinot Noir, and I think that we were really the first vineyard anywhere near us at all that had full scale ferments in, because we're picking on acidity. All of our neighbors were still like, you know, a week to 2 weeks before even thinking about getting started. So we started making wine in full scale ferments, and you could smell it in the fermenter just after 24 hours of soaking up. And I knew what was coming because we'd made wines in 2017 and 18 with smoke tainted fruit from Southern Oregon and then from the gorge. And I knew we had a problem. And so we went another day. We processed all of our Pinot Noir in only 48 hours, which is a little unusual, but I was worried about having it hang out there in the smoke any longer. And I tried all sorts of things. I took my tractor and filled the sprayer with water, and we sprayed 100 gallons an acre of water on the fruit to try to wash off the ash. And then we were really careful with the way we destemmed, but 48 hours into it, all the ferments smelled like smoke. And so I pulled the plug on the whole thing, and I went over and talked to my colleague Jim Prosser at JK Carrier, and I took him some samples, and Tyson Crowley was there, and I said, look, you know, this is what we have, and it's alarming, and I'm gonna press everything off right now. And they thought I was kind of off the rocker a little bit, but I came home and we pressed 26 tons of Pinot Noir in 27 hours. We had both the presses running, and it's really not typical winemaking. You know, usually we spend a lot of time being very thoughtful and tasting, and I knew it was time to get everything off the skins. So we pressed everything off and put it in tank, and it sat there for several days. And we continued making some white wines, you know, stuff that's just pressed off. The juice ferments seem to be okay. Our estate Riesling has a little bit of a smoky essence to it. Our Amphora Blanc, the Edelswicker style, it's clean, but these are wines that we got off the skins right away. And in hindsight, I wish I'd known this. We would have made more rosé, maybe some sparkling wine and some white Pinot Noir, rather than trying to do stuff on the skins. And so having everything pressed off and in tanks, I was kind of at a loss what to do. The wines were too ripe to be rosé, but they didn't have any body or structure, so they didn't really work as red wine either. So I got to thinking about an experience that Luke and I had at Valgiano, And Luke, do you remember, was that 2015 that we were there? And they
We were
had
there,
the
we were there in 15, but it was probably the 14. We were talking about the 14 Hale vintage, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And so they wound up with a wine that didn't have any tannin. And their winemaker was explaining that he macerated seeds the next year. He saved the seeds and filled barrels with them and extracted like a organic seed tannin to spool back into the wine that didn't have any body and structure. So I thought, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea. And I reached out to my friend Chad Stock, and I said, Chad, he works out at David Hill now, which is really kind of about as west as you can get in the Willamette Valley, tucked up against the Coast Range. And they had done some analysis and didn't have the levels of smoke that we had. By the way, our analysis came back at 36, and a level of 8 is suggested that it's not even worth making wine with it. So the levels here were like astronomically high as any place I've heard of in the valley. But the fruit out there was clean. And I said, would it be possible for me to come get some seeds from you? And his wife, Bree, was on the phone, and she said, well, you should take the lees too. Actually, it was Chad. Chad said, you should take the lees. And then Bree said, well, you should take the skins. So we concocted this crazy plan. And I went out there every time they pressed a fermenter off, and got all of the lees, the seeds, the skins out of the fermenter and trucked it back here. And we started rehydrating those contents with our juice. And the idea was that we would build some structure and some body in the wine, and get the tannin we were looking for and some more color. But we were going to do it with someone else's skins that didn't have the consequence of the wildfires. So we started doing this, and it took a week and a half. I brought 26 tons of pumice back here, and we macerated on that pumice for a couple weeks, and we made a huge headway with the wines. But it's quite interesting. We have, I think, guess like a Frankenstein wine. We've got this really super blue fruited note that comes from the vines at David Hill. It's much more stone fruited, dark, like blue fruits, blueberries and blackberries, and we never see that on our site. But because we were using the skins from a vineyard that's 40 miles away, we have a totally different character to the wine. And I think we made good progress. The post-treatment versus the pre-treatment wines are like remarkably better, the stuff that we treated with the skins from David Hill. But at this point, the smoke is still there, and it's better than it was. We felt like there was some kind of reverse osmosis that happened with maybe some of those glycol compounds from our juice going into the David Hill skins and got left behind. And at this point, what we're going to start working on is washing the wine with white wine lees. So I've got about 50 gallons of really delicious Riesling lees, and we're going to start introducing those lees into the tanks as we're coming out of the amphora to wash the wine. And we'll see if we can make some headway with the white lees. We're trying to achieve a wine we're trying to get to the point where we have a delicious wine that we've made without using synthetic products. And a lot of people are going to be fine, like Union Wine. I talked to my friend JP there, and they charcoal carbon filtered everything as they processed it. So they don't, they were able to remove those glycol compounds by stripping the wine down to nothing, and then they'll just rebuild it back with bio lees and other stuff, other products. But we're trying to make a delicious wine this vintage without without using anything other than natural components of other wines. So we'll see where the white wine lees washing gets us. This has been, obviously a challenging year for everyone, but having to shut the tasting room down in March and then only be open for a couple months, and then have this fire, and the fruit set was so poor this year. It's like half of the normal yields that we would have out of our vineyard before the fires happened. So I don't know, the unfortunate reality for us is that we've gone from 2,500 cases in 2019 to 500 for 2020. We may get a couple hundred more out of the Pinot that we work with, but you know, this is a year where it's tough. And it's really tough to now be starting the pruning, you know, all over again without the prospect of the sales coming from the wines in 2020 that we don't really have. But you know, I think a lot of people are in the same. Some of the wines are going to be delicious. And again, you know, in hindsight, I wish I'd known that there was so much impact. We would have probably not made red wine, but we didn't know. And you know, it's the reality of what it is. So all we can really do now is focus on making the best wines we can with the small amount of product we have, and you know, getting ready for a new vintage. And I would say it's not all doom and gloom. There are going to be some producers that are in a much better position than us, depending on where they were at and how close they were to the fires. And I know, you know, there are other people that are probably in a worse position than us. Yeah, so that's like full transparency. It's not good. It's not a very positive situation, but.
Andrew, do you feel like, you know, I guess the saying is planning's useful, plans are useless. Do you have a sense that now knowing what you know, working with this vintage, that you have some plan for, you know, these increased smoke events going forward, you know, maybe every other year or every third year? Do you have a sense that you know, you kind of know what you want to do going forward?
I mean, kind of, Luke. I know we don't want to make wines like this again. I mean, you know, I get migraine headaches, and you know, a trigger for me is smoke. And having had my head in those fermenters for a couple days, there's this smell that if I even like smell those wines now, it starts to make me feel sick to my stomach. And it's a mental thing. It's like this trigger, and I don't want to make wine like that. So I don't know how to answer that. I think, you know, if we have another smoke event, it's so hard to predict, like the severity of it and how much it's gonna, you know, affect a certain vineyard versus another vineyard. And I think I'm gonna be way more on high alert. If we start to see something like this coming down the pipeline again, I think we will pivot our production, and we'll make wines that are juice fermented. We'll get off the skins. Maybe we don't make red wine in a vintage like this where we have this sort of wildfire. And it, you know, it's hard reflecting now. I was just tasting some wines made in Southern Oregon the last couple years that they're smoky, and now I've got this like thing etched into my brain, and I'm so hyper tuned to this ashtray on the back of the palate. Like, I don't know, even in small doses, it's not appealing to me. So I don't think I'm answering your question, but I guess, you know, we'll have to really be thinking forward. And if we see that this is coming again, I don't want to wind up in this position again. And part of the problem also is I listened to a biodynamic consultant who was here, who's moved up from California, who's been in Napa and made several vintages with smoke tainted wines there, Cabernet. And he said, well, you know, the last thing you want to do is pick early and make a green smoky wine. But, you know, and I thought about that, and I was like, okay, that makes sense. You know, we'd be better off to have a wine that is typical for us, that has smoke that we can address. But yeah, we're in uncharted territory also. You know, we've never had to deal with these things here. So I don't know. I'm kind of brain farting right now.
No, thank you. I think we're going to open it up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
How are you? Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy
Hello to the
holidays.
family. How's Andrea?
He's great. Yeah, at the beach with the kids, chilling out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What are your plans with the Franken wine, considering using amphora versus oak to help it to dissipate some of that? And then I also have a question about the Novum. Did you make what you made one for New Zealand? Is that right? And
A couple. Yeah, I sent a couple to Domaine Rewa in New Zealand. They just went out last week. I was sharing with Trini, I'm working on a really exciting project with a spirit maker. So I've been trying to move into the spirit world. We've been working with brewers for the last several years. But now we're moving into the spirit world, and we've got a gentleman who's making Arak in them, which is like a anise-based Lebanese liqueur. And we've got a guy who's made Nicino in them a couple years, vodka. But I'm sending over the course of 2 years, 300 of the Novum XL. These are 950 pounds wet. The ones that are like just under 500 liters. So I'm sending 300 of them to the Yucatan for a corn-based whiskey product that's being made in Mexico. And so it's incredibly exciting. The scale of the order is phenomenal. It should get me out of the teaching gig permanently. So that's been pretty exciting and kind of a new frontier. So yes, we have been sending them overseas, which is a quite complicated thing. I've got a couple that are going to go to Quebec also. So that's been fun. And then so the Franken wine, what's going to happen with it? Well, I don't know. We'll see if we can make any headway. So I have had it in amphora. Everything is in amphora. But now at this point, I'm worried that we're going to start to leach some of the glycol compounds, some of the smokiness into the clay. And so I'm going to get out of the amphora because I don't want to ruin the containers for future vintages. My hope when we went into them was that we would be able to create a wine that is different than other people's smoky Pinot Noir because it's made in clay versus wood. But it's the amphora is just it's not competing with the essence of the smoke. So we're gonna this week come out of them, clean them really well, and then put them in tank, put the wines in tank and do the lees washing. And then I'm gonna try putting some of the wine into wood. Because we have a lot of barrique and puncheon that aren't being used this year, and we'll see, what happens there. So I'm definitely still in experimental trial mode.
Is there any science on guaiacol absorption into clay? Is there any kind of testing on that?
Not that I know of at all, Luke.
Could you refire them to get rid of that, if there is any?
Yeah, you could, but the problem is once you've made wine in them, the sugars that leach into the wall, when you heat up, you have to go all the way to temperature or the sugars caramelize and you wind up with something that smells like a bread factory and it tastes like sweet pastries. So, I mean, yeah, you could treat them by refiring them, but the firings are 4 days long and I don't really want to have to refire all the pots. We may need to. I don't think we've absorbed so much compound that it's going to be a huge issue. But it's interesting, to think about. I initially thought that the clay might do a really great job absorbing the glycol compound. So I was initially thinking about putting like a couple 1,000 pounds of broken pots in the bottom of a big steel tank and putting the wine in there to see if we could suck some of that in, but I don't know.
That's something I was kind of thinking about too, is like maybe like a bunch of fire terracotta briquettes you could just add to your wine and easily kind of just take them out or filter them out. I don't know if that would make a difference or not, rather than having to ruin all your pots. But I like the broken shard idea.
Well, I have many broken pots. I was explaining to Trini yesterday, my success rate with the big Novum right now is 20%. So, I've got I've got 10 or 15 of them sitting out in the workshop that are broken. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we gain anything or not at this point.
Yeah, I wonder if they're less vitrified too, if they would absorb more of the glycol.
I would.
If that would
assume
would help.
So. Yeah.
I don't know if I had too many questions. I think you answered pretty much everything. I was going to ask you about if you're still teaching, and it sounds like you are. And I didn't know that. It sounds like you're doing so much at once. So I was going to ask how you balance teaching with your amphora production and your winemaking and your estate farming practices. It sounds like it's insane amount of work for one person or a couple of people to do all the time.
Yeah, there's not much bandwidth left at this point. I am
Yeah.
still teaching full-time pottery, ceramics on Zoom, which is a total train wreck.
I didn't even think about that.
I mean, I've tried. I put a lot of effort into it. I always want to, give it my absolute best. So I sent all the kids. I have 400 students this year because we are in quarters, not semesters. I have 400 ceramic students. And I sent all of them, well, quarter by quarter, I've sent them all supply kits with clay and tools. And I have a drop-off station and a pickup station at school. And I go there 3 times a week and I fire, and the kids can drop things off. And, I'm trying to process through so the experience is real for them. But last week or the week before winter vacation, I had an entire week with a class where not one kid turned their camera on or put anything in the chat or said anything. So it's so unrewarding as a teacher to be talking to a black screen for an hour and a half, 4 times a week with nothing, no response. And it's so heartbreaking what's happened. The school I teach at is challenging, and 75% of our kids are on free lunch. It's 60% Hispanic. And what this COVID thing did with online learning is just magnify inequality. And I'm just grading privilege. It's the kids that are turning stuff in and submitting. They're the 5 white kids in each class whose parents have a space for them to do the work and have a car to drive them to get the stuff to the school. And, the other families, the kids are working, trying to make ends meet. And there's 5 of them in an apartment, and they don't want to show you their living circumstances. And it's been so hard. This is my 21st year teaching, the same subject in the same school. And I've never seen so much inequality. Some kids don't even have an internet, no hotspot. They have no way. Some of them aren't even in the state. I've got some kids that are in Mexico right now trying to take ceramics through Zoom from in Oregon. It's,
my gosh.
Yeah, so that it's been tough. But I've hired another employee, so I have 2 full-time people making the amphora with me, and then Phil, our assistant winemaker, is here. He's here full-time also, and then Gonzalo and the people in the vineyard. We've got lots of good help.
That's good. That's great. You ever tried working with Sculpey with your students, so you don't have to fire everything? They can bake in their oven.
Well, there's another teacher who taught ceramics first quarter, and she sent everyone home with air dry clay. And I was like, you know what? That's so not real. I wanted to try to make it as real as possible. So we've been working with actual material.
Yeah, that's got to be tough as an art teacher.
It's been super, super difficult.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Here's vacuum. You want a vacuum here? Oh, here's your clothes. Downstairs.
Nicholas, sounds like you have looks like you have a question.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, let's not talk about 2020 anymore.
Great.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, man. I'm a cellar master up here in Washington, so I'm kind of like the antithesis of everything you were talking about. I'd make wine 3 hours away from the vineyards, use a shit ton of new oak, but a different style altogether. I've enjoyed your wines. My family owns a restaurant, and I've experienced them through those avenues. I have a wine making question for you. It was interesting hearing about I understand like with clay too, and like the concrete tanks, that the porous, even in wood, will have like slower ferments because you have more temperature control. What I'm kind of curious is about because you're not adding any inoculants and stuff, like what's your ML ferment like?
So the microflora loves living in the amphora. I didn't really touch on this.
Yeah.
We don't use any malic bacteria at all. It's in the pots. So
Ready?
we go through malic as we're going through primary. In fact, all of our wines now are done.
Oh, wow.
Yep, and that's without any inoculum at all. But on the flip side to that, other microflora love living in the amphora as well. So if you get Brett or Pediococcus, you get a population that can take hold. It can take hold, with fever.
Okay.
So, yeah, and actually that's interesting. The Trousseau has a fairly high pH, and so we have to be really careful with that varietal in particular, with how we handle things in the cellar, because once you get a population started of anything, it really want to thrive. And this is I think another interesting reason why brewers like Trevor at DeGard are loving these pots so much, because all of the Brett that they want to have leading the ferments, it's in the pots. Once it's introduced, it's living, and it's gonna do its job.
And so for like maintenance on because once you get like Brett living in, like for conventional, I guess if I have wood with Brett, I would just assume burn the barrel. If you have like a culture that kind of grows, do you have to refire, or is there like a treatment for clay? I'd imagine it might actually be easier than wood.
Yeah, well, we can heat them. We clean them with 350-degree water, or
Okay.
but you wind up with the same problem. You can't really penetrate deep enough into the pot to wipe out all the population. So what we can do here is sterilize them by refiring them.
Okay.
Which is not ideal, because every time you fire, you're going to take integrity out of the vessel.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I think the reality is that these things live in everyone's cellar. I mean, everyone's got Brett. It's just a matter of how you control it and can contain it. And
right.
We've done some interesting stuff this last year with scorpions, with some of our lots, to see exactly what we had. And I think a lot of winemakers are afraid to talk about it, because if you mention Brett, it's like the whole project is garbage.
Yeah.
And
right.
it's part of what is in the cellar, and Pediococcus also. So we've had several analysis done that were very surprising. And so we've had to take some tactics to try to mitigate that. So we're really careful with cross-pollinating from one container to another. And we actually have a set of containers right now that is quarantined, that's outside the cellar, that is slated to be sterilized, refired.
Okay.
Yep.
And with that, like, I know like the evolution of oak, like you were saying, neutral, like you're using 10-year-old barrels. Do you find that the amphora, as you've been, I guess you've been like, it's relatively new for you, even in the whole scheme of time, it's not a lot. Are you noticing an evolution of the amphora the more you ferment in these?
Yeah, for sure. I think we think about it a lot like seasoning a cast iron pan.
Okay.
The more use they have, the more the tartrates build, the more like nuanced character they have. We've kind of fallen into a protocol of using certain containers for certain wines. So we have a set of them that we use for our skin contact Pinot Gris. We have a set that we use for Trousseau. But really, they get better with each use.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And then
The sustainability piece is always part of the equation. You know, there's an oak barrel is not sustainable. It takes a generation to grow. You cut it down, you use it 3 years, turns into a planter. And the amphora are the opposite. You know, you make the amphora and you use it for a generation, and then you hand it down to your kids.
Yeah,
and they can use it. And
that's pretty slick. And then my last one with your, so I imagine you're not, because you're only adding sulfur at bottling. I imagine you're not moving the wine too much, not a lot of racking. Do you adjust that if you do introduce a large amount of oxygen? So like, let's say you have some like high reduction or something and you're going to rack it, or do you just not?
No, we use like human intervention to achieve things rather than chemical intervention. So yeah, if we have a lot that's stinky, rather than feeding it with DAP, you know, or superfood or something, we'll give it oxygen. And sometimes we actually give it oxygen with a sparging stone.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like finished wine. So like you're in the élevage stage and maybe you're getting some like, you know, reduction. And at that point, you know, like I guess we would like stir the lees or we would rack it depending on how bad the reduction was showing. But if I rack it, I'm going to introduce a ton of oxygen, which becomes food for bacteria. And so then in conventional, I would throw some sulfur at it to bind with that oxygen. I don't know if you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we're on the same page. I think, you know, if you've got reduction and you add oxygen later in the wine's life, you can wind up with mercaptans and other like problems that you can't really address without drastic measures. So when we do rack things, so I guess to back up, we have gotten into the practice of going into the amphora or the barrel really clean, which we didn't do in the first several years I made the wines. So we will do like a 4 or 5 day settle after press. So we have like minimal amount of lees. There's still lees in there, but it's none of the heavies are in there. And then we typically rack once during élevage. Usually it's right after we get through Malik and the wines are like settled down. And we're racking with a sparging stone on our pump. So, you know, we rack with inert gas in the wine line. So we you know, address the headspace in the tanks, but we also use gas in the line. And we're careful with oxygen. We actually don't taste the wines very often. We only top once a month, but we don't go into them and taste but a couple times during the élevage. We just keep them sealed. And, you know, that's trying to be hyper vigilant about oxygen. We already have enough oxygen in the wines made in clay as it is, so we don't want to add any more.
Yeah. People get a little too bung happy sometimes.
Yeah, we try to just let things be, and you know, really, we're not going to do anything anyhow, unless there's like a massive problem. We're going to just let them ride. So
cool. Hey, thanks, man. Again, sorry. Yeah, it's been pretty brutal talking to friends in Napa and Oregon, and even up here, we're kind of most of our ferments went through without any smell. But I had a friend make a wine a couple years ago that the guy didn't show up until like a year in the barrel, and we messed around and tried making a vermouth out of a red wine, which is very not traditional, but it was just something to do. But yeah, it's a tough one, man. I feel like Oregon's you guys got beat up the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, you know,
you guys are gonna have a rock star vintage. 2021 is gonna be rock star.
Things happen for a reason, and you know, there's a glut of wine on the market right now, and I don't know. It's okay. It's okay. We're going to be all right. We're going to run out of wine. We're going to have a hard time supporting our markets, out of state, but we're going to make it. I feel for, there are people in a way worse position than us, and I feel for them for
I
sure.
mean, yeah, my family owns 2 restaurants, so we've been filling it on a different. It's not smoke, but
Yeah.
But I think as they say, like, fail once, try again, fail better. So we just keep, we'll learn from this, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be better for it. Cream rises to the top. So thanks. That's it for my questions.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
So you had talked about briefly about maybe in the future, if for some reason smoke becomes a problem down in Oregon, and talking about maybe making sparkling wines. My thoughts are just like, what sort of technique would you think about for making sparkling wines? Would you add on the process of amphora aging in that as well? Or your sort of like quick thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay. So this year was going to be the first year that we made everything in clay, and so I guess regardless of what we're going to do, we're going to continue to push into the world of amphora. So we filled I think it was 86 amphora up this year, and the day we got them all filled was the day that we started pressing them off. So it was like the most insane amount of work to fill them all up and then just to empty them all starting, later that day. So I think regarding the sparkling wine, it's hard because if we're going to make like a traditional method sparkling wine, we would need to be harvesting really early. And, there's, who knows what's going to happen with the timing. If we have a fire that's, burning, do we decide to make sparkling wine and then the fire dissipates and nothing happens, and then we've got sparkling wine and no red wine. I think my wife would be the one who should really field this question. She is determined to make traditional method sparkling wine. That's why we planted aligote here. So I didn't mention aligote. We'll have an acre of aligote after the spring, and that's her project to make bubbles. I think pet nat is kind of fun, but those wines are a lot of work for not much profit. The pet nats take a lot of energy and effort, and so I guess really we will probably continue to make some pet nats, but my wife's end game is to make traditional sparkling wine.
Cool. Thank you so much.
And how that factors into a fire, the people, like, if people who were planned to make sparkling wine from the beginning, they're sitting pretty this year because they harvested 2 weeks before we had any sign of fires coming. Yeah, it's a lot of unknowns.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, Andrew, thank you for your time. It was
Thanks, Andrew.
great to
You're very
catch
welcome.
That was incredibly informative.
Thank you.
Andrew.
I don't. It's so early in the morning. I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, you guys. So I hope you got something out of that.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm gonna save the recording and I'll have it up on our Instagram link on our Instagram page in case you need to revisit any part of this. But thanks,
Thank
Andrew.
you.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you.